This is the second panel of the 7th Annual U.S. Mexico Security Conference. Thank you for being there. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. And it's a pleasure to have you all and to have our panelists. This is going to be a very important panel concerning security challenges that are related to Mexico and that are of prime importance today in this country. This panel is titled The Fentanyl Trade and Its Manifestations in Mexico. We have today 4 great panelists that are going to present 2 important works that have been done. As we know, the trade of fentanyl and the connections with Mexico and Asia and the transportation of fentanyl from Asia through Mexico to the United States has been commented very broadly, but not with a lot of details. And we don't know the implications of that trade in Mexico and the United States. There are a lot of myths about this. And these 2 works, I had the opportunity to read them both, and they are excellent, and they cover different aspects of this issue. And it's very important to know more, to know details, and to stop mystifications of these phenomena, of these important phenomena that are connected. One phenomenon that has implications for Mexico and the United States and its relationship, and the security challenges that this phenomenon imply. So first of all, I would like to start with the first work they're going to present together. Stephen Dudley is co-director of Inside Crime. Stephen Dudley is co-director of Inside Crime, which monitors, analyzes, and investigates organized crime in the Americas. It's based in Washington, D.C. Steve works with a team of 11 investigators and various contributors to the region to give the public a more complete view of how organized crime works in the Americas, as well as its impact on public policy and communities from the Rio Grande to Patagonia. So Steve has done a lot of work on organized crime in the Americas, and his work is well known, and we all have studied, use it as reference, and I'm a big admirer of the work Inside Crime does and Steve Dudley does. And he's going to present a work with Jaime Lopez Aranda. Jaime Lopez Aranda is policy analyst and a partner at Pt2, a consultant agency in public policy design evaluation for think tanks, non-governmental organizations, governments, and private sector client. He was also the advisor to the Commissioner General of the Federal Police of Mexico, a professor for the Masters in Public Policy at the Universidad Iberoamericana, and the head of the National Information Center at the National Public Security System. So welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm very interested in your presentation, and congratulations for the great report.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. Good morning. A couple of caveats before I start. Obviously, thank you very much for the Wilson Center. I was a Wilson Center fellow, so it's great to be back. Always great to present. Thank you very much, Duncan and Eric and the Mexico Institute. Jaime and I are here presenting this, but this was a huge team effort. Be remiss if I didn't mention Deb Bonello, who really led the effort, Mario Moreno, who's at the University of Chicago now, but he was down in Mexico for a time and also in Colombia helping us out, Tristan Clavel, Bjorn Klested, and Juan Restrepo and Ana Isabel Rico, who did our graphics on this. The other thing is about our focus. Our focus is Mexico, of course. On this one, it is looking at their role and looking specifically at crime, organized crime in this regard. That's what we do. So we don't want to, tilt your gaze completely on that as if that were the only part of the problem. I will mention this in several occasions, but this scourge that the U.S. is facing as it relates to fentanyl and opioids in general is a homegrown scourge. It's a homegrown epidemic. Pharmaceuticals, doctors, and others. This has been documented. Hopefully we'll get a little bit more about that. So we fully realize that. We're focused on Mexico, of course, but also we need to consider China's role in this and the fact that we don't know how much directly sourced fentanyl comes from China into the United States versus how much is passing through Mexico. We don't know. We got a lot of different estimates from different people. So those are my two caveats, and then we'll just jump right in. Our report was based on really we cast a very wide net because it's a very big black hole we're dealing with at this stage as it relates to fentanyl. We just don't know that much about it. And along the way, we came across this case, which was this case related to a Bulgarian biochemist named Anton Petrov Kolkin. He had made some suspicious contacts, including in Mexico, where he'd set up a lab that was making fentanyl and carfentanil. Those of you who don't know, carfentanil is a fentanyl analog. It's about 100 times stronger than fentanyl. Fentanyl is extremely potent. Carfentanil is absolutely lethal. The authorities in Mexico and the United States infiltrated Kolkin's network. They took part in some meetings in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, and also in Tijuana, Mexico. They tracked him and his boss, who we haven't yet been able to confirm, but we think was, part of the Sinaloa cartel dating back to the 90s. And eventually located their lab where they executed a series of raids in August and September, just this last year. They found 20,000 counterfeit pills in a pill press. The case brings together really a nice all the different bits that we cover in this report, and that what we'll present to you today. Our main task, again, was to give an overview of Mexico's role in the trade, but what we found is that in order to do that, we needed to look at the entire distribution chain and understand how Mexico fit into that distribution chain. The precursor chemicals in this case almost assuredly came from China, which is part one of our report. China is the second largest pharmaceutical production, has the second largest pharmaceutical production industry in the world. Literally hundreds, if not thousands of labs. There's 160,000 estimated chemical factories there, and literally hundreds, if not thousands, are making illicit chemicals of all types with little oversight. They're moving these chemicals, finished products, to places like the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and using, of course, all the tried and true methods, fake labels, freight forwarding companies, to move it. Much of this, as I mentioned, is going directly to the United States, in particular ready-made fentanyl, which is sent in very small consignments via the U.S. mail system mostly. So that was the first element. We also had a specialist in this case, Kolkin, who was making the actual fentanyl. Fentanyl isn't that difficult to make, unfortunately. He had loose connections, as I mentioned, to the Sinaloa cartel and also to Dominican networks. That's why they were meeting in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, which is the main distribution networks that operate in the northeast of the United States. And the drugs, of course. The drugs were fake pills, counterfeit pills. The evolution of, and we cover this in the report, the evolution of fentanyl has made it so that now we believe that most people who are consuming it don't even know they're consuming it. And a lot of them most of them are consuming it through methods like this, counterfeit, in this case, counterfeit Oxycontin pills. They call them pressed blues, and they look just like Oxycontin, and they feel like them as well. So there's a lot of reasons why people wouldn't even know, and that's because, fentanyl has this reputation. So this is what we're seeing across the board, and this is what is so disturbing, is that fentanyl overall is just this kind of game changer, the kind of drug we haven't seen before. These can be moved in very small consignments to users who don't even know they're taking it. Obviously, in the United States, you have a very ready-made market for this. We liken it to the We liken it to the microchip market, where we think, over time you can just get this down to the smallest microscopic size of drugs. You can imagine how difficult that would be to stop with a border wall. So, and we can already see it. Carfentanil, which I mentioned, is 100 times stronger. There were 0 exhibits found by the DEA labs in 2015, and there were 6,000 exhibits found of carfentanil in 2017. Much of these drugs or precursors are making their way through Mexico and into the hands of Mexico criminal networks, and that's where I'll turn it over to Jaime, who will talk more about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steven. Glad to be here as well. Shout out to the team who worked on this, and thank you all for having us. As Steve mentioned, can I have the... Let me just quickly. Thank you. I'm going to focus on the Mexico side of things, which is the main thrust of the report. But as Steve mentioned, it's also a part of a bigger picture. It's part of an ecosystem. And in order to understand the significance or lack of significance of Mexico, because we also discussed this in the report, the actual leverage that the Mexican organizations and producers actually have vis-a-vis, for example, the Chinese ones or even the American ones. What one first has to understand is that, as Steve said, this is a major economic game changer. The fact that fentanyl can be so easily produced and in such large quantities, and it can almost be produced on demand, as we have seen in China, signals a fundamental shift in traditional economics of narcotics in a way that methamphetamines did not bring about. This is not the first time we have seen a chemical drug making its way and having a big boom in consumption. But for some reason, fentanyl appears to have a much higher economic potential. Methamphetamines, from the one hand, for example, they were the precursors of one of the major cartels in Mexico, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or CJNG, as they are usually called. Those guys got their start with the Milenio Cartel. They were basically making methamphetamines in Manzanillo, which will come up in the presentation. But they were quickly and easily overrun by domestic producers of methamphetamines in the United States. What was a major changer for the Mexican cartels was cocaine back in the day. The demise of the big Colombian cartels, enter the stage the Sinaloa cartel, the Juarez cartel, all the big Mexican cartels. They were propelled by cocaine. So the actual effects of fentanyl and the Chinese trade and the ability or lack thereof of the Mexican cartels to partake in this new boom will have a real significant effect on the composition of the Mexican organized crime markets and the Mexican illegal markets. Some of these effects, as Roman and Natalia will discuss in the report, had to do with the ground level poppy growers. But it will also have significant effects in terms of violence and in terms of the reach of the cartels and of the overall strategy that the previous panelists were discussing for the Mexican government. The Mexican government may have declared rhetorically that the war is over, but a new war is coming, whether they want it or not. What do we know now? Let's jump straight into it. First thing, and this is something that we have already, we were able to establish after a lot of digging, because unsurprisingly, the Mexican authorities are not paying that much attention to this. But we were able to establish that most of the fentanyl flow in Mexico and production follows the traditional routes. That is, it is superimposed, if you will, on the previous production networks that had already been established. So, maritime ports is, there's 22 ports in Mexico, but about 10 of them actually handle 85% of the traffic. And when it comes to narcotics, it's 3 of them. It's Lázaro Cárdenas, it's Manzanillo, which are on the Pacific coast, and Veracruz, which is in the Gulf, but Veracruz is a relatively major player. We have known that these ports have been the major entrance for all sorts of illegal substances, precursors and finished product for the past 10 years, more like the next 30 years. And they remain at the top. They remain the leaders in that sense, and they remain the prime entrance for this. There's a lot of reasons. Well, I mean, some of it is corruption, as they were discussing in the previous panel. Some of it is the fact that a very aggressive enforcement in the sports will have a major disruptive effect on legal economic flows. So that also provides a lot of coverage. Think Long Beach in California. I mean, yeah, of course, you can seize you can scan every container, and you're going to lose billions of dollars in a day. In a smaller scale, obviously. After that, I mean, this is Manzanillo, Lázaro Cárdenas. They are being converted to fentanyl in Mexico, as they were saying. I mean, fentanyl, it can be brought in as a finished product, or it can be assembled in Mexico from precursors. Which one is more common, we don't know. And why it happens, well, it really depends on the capabilities and the preferences of the people doing it, which is really important because we have two intertwined hypotheses as to who are the major players in this. And their preferences, their abilities would vary greatly. After that, you bring it, as we estimate, about 75% of all the fentanyl trade goes through Tijuana, which, as you know, is a major port. You got the San Diego port right next to it. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why Tijuana will always be the preferred contraband spot. I mean, for eternity, probably, as long as contraband exists. At the same time, as it was mentioned in the previous panel, the actual state of Tijuana's underground economies is in a state of flux, and we are not really sure who's controlling what, which again will become more relevant in defining the actors. There were some seizures in different regions. We'll see in a bit. There you go. This graphic is useful for two reasons. On the one hand, it shows, again, assuming that drug seizures follow drug trafficking routes, which might or might not be a big assumption, but it usually holds out. Not in a direct relationship, but yeah, for the most part, most seizures occur where most trafficking is occurring. And it also shows, well, it doesn't really show here, but we discussed in the report, the more recent nature of fentanyl seizures. We're talking hundreds of grams quantities seizures in 2014, and we're talking dozens of kilos in 2018. It's still relatively smallish, compared to marijuana, compared to cocaine. But one has to remember that, as Steve mentioned, very little quantity, very small amounts of fentanyl can produce like a great gain. So talking about 100 kilo seizure is actually a big deal in Mexico. And particularly, again, when you're going from 1 to 2 kilos per year to 100 kilos in a single operation. And again, as we discussed, most of the seizures actually occur in the Tijuana corridor. The Baja California border, Tijuana, Mexicali, but most of it is Tijuana. Tijuana municipality. Some of it happens here, and again, this is outliers here. Some of them are related to labs, some of them are related to upstart production efforts. But for the most part, as I was saying, the report found that the overlap with traditional routes, trafficking routes and production routes is actually pretty stable. Now, from here, we also have the seizures, from the DEA side, the U.S. side of the DEA CBP. What is relevant here is that cocaine, heroin, marijuana, methamphetamine, well, mostly methamphetamine, marijuana, and cocaine, they remain relatively stable over time, pointing to a mature market. And Steve already showed, we have the spike in the fentanyl seizures, which points to an ever-evolving market. It's not only about the amount of fentanyl that is making its way into the United States. It's also about the amount of people involved. It's also about any booming market creates opportunities for newcomers. Barriers to entry being as low as they are, they create opportunities for newcomers. And opportunities for newcomers in the legal markets tend to bring about violence. Great deals of it. Because most competition is not done on a price and quality basis. It is also done on trying to control distribution networks and trafficking networks. So when you see a spike in seizures, it is bound to follow there's a spike in players. which leads us to our two hypotheses. We had two hypotheses here, and we didn't have enough convincing evidence to put forth one of them. We actually had a huge debate, internal debate, in terms of the two hypotheses. And Stephen, never the Solomon type boss that he is, he decided to put the two of them in the reports, which I think was a great idea, because it gives us a chance to have a deeper discussion on this. The first hypothesis is that we have the cartels. And the cartels are big, and the cartels are vertically integrated, and they have control every single step of the way. And this is basically, among some of us, it's known as the DEA hypothesis. Cartels have the ability to react to markets because they control every stage of every step in the production chain. The second hypothesis is that the Sinaloa cartel and the CJNG are umbrella organizations that are subcontracting and negotiating constantly with smaller groups, which means that they might or might not be able to control a few choke points in Tijuana, in Lázaro Cárdenas, but they are not able to respond to market changes as fast. They actually depend on local producers, which is something that is borne by Roman and Nat's study, in particular for the poppy growers. And as such, it enables people like Colkin, for example, who might not be as integrated into the networks, so he might just be a peripheral, player in the networks. And again, this would greatly multiply the number of players. Now, the feasibility of each hypothesis we have divided by state. In Baja California, for example, if CGNG and Sinaloa are fighting it off for Tijuana to the death, as some people are saying, or if they are just, basically logistic companies in Tijuana. Well, logistics was a side of extortion. You will use our services to pass the products on the other side, or you will die. In Colima, again, there might be, the CGNGs might have control of the Manzanillo port, as they would do in Lázaro Cárdenas. Or again, and this is something that we have been pushing, some of us have been pushing for a while now, nobody can really control these ports. They are too big, the traffic is too much, there are too many opportunities. There's evidence either way. And the fact that the Mexican government is kind of closer to the DEA hypothesis in terms of the cartel's vertical integration makes it really hard to take their own data, at face value. So still, we just pose the possibilities here. And Guerrero, and this is something that is really relevant for the next report. Again, the level of the evidence in Guerrero points more towards a more loose network of producers, buyers, distributors, as would the evidence from Sinaloa in terms of marijuana, not so much in fentanyl. And the actual level of control in Guerrero, as you know, since the demise of the Beltran-Leyva cartel, has been hotly disputed for a few years now. Who controls Guerrero? Most likely nobody. And with this, I will turn it over to the final part of the report, the destination. And as it's known, the largest market for everything in the world.
Thanks, Jaime. There's a couple of things I think I should mention there also. One is that the whole idea of legal diversion, we have discounted that as a major portion of the supply of fentanyl in the United States. So that's important that we had that as a thesis as well, and we discarded that. We just did not see enough evidence to point in that direction. The other is that, yes, we're talking about, big monolithic structures versus this sort of fragmented nature of cartels. And I think that, for us, the important thing here is to think of this as kind of a proxy discussion about the way things are moving in general anyway, and especially as it relates to synthetic drugs. Because we do think that this is a game changer for many reasons. One of the main reasons being, of course, the very low barriers of entry to this trade, and then the ability of these smaller players to operate either wholly or at least semi-independently, which is why you have such a giant China direct to the United States market, because that old paradigm is being broken into pieces. So we need to consider that as, not just the present, but also possibly the future, especially as it relates to synthetic substances. As it relates to, obviously, the movement of this drug, well, we can see by the incident reports, if you will, the number submitted is the concentration is in the Northeast. That's because of the kind of legacy of the original delivery methods of this, which was the white powder heroin. And the connection to the Dominicans was a connection because they traditionally controlled the white powder heroin trade in the Northeast. So that was the original delivery method, but over time we've seen that evolve. In fact, it's evolving extremely quickly and, again, alarmingly quickly to spread out into other substances. Maybe the most important one to mention in this regard is methamphetamine, for two reasons. One is because there is a very strong belief from those we spoke to in Mexico that there could be a very strong correlation between those who produce methamphetamine and those who could produce fentanyl. Same type of structures. They have access to the same players in China, so they would have their sort of legacy contacts to the chemical industry. They would have your chemists, your Culkins, if you will. They would have them on board already. They would have the infrastructure, etc. So we think that there is a strong correlation, maybe stronger, between methamphetamine and fentanyl than fentanyl and heroin, for instance. So we might see some diversion there, and that may start to maybe when we start getting more seizures of laboratories in Mexico. So far, we've only had 3, so not a really big sample size. Then maybe we'll start to get more information on whether or not that theory bears out. What we are seeing that bear out is in the United States, though. There are the areas that are some of the highest concentrated areas of use of methamphetamine. We're also seeing an increasing number of fentanyl cases and fentanyl overdoses, and then fentanyl incident reports that are going through the forensic division of the DEA. That's very troubling, of course. And again, it's being mixed with other drugs. Why? Well, the notion is that it's so highly addictive, if you slip a little bit in there, you're going to give them a slightly different high, and a high they will remember and separate from their other cocaine or methamphetamine experiences and return. So the notion is that, we're talking about fentanyl here, but this is a proxy discussion. We could be talking about any synthetic drug hereafter that someone develops that increases the addictiveness of something, and then could be laced into your sort of legacy drugs as well. And you're seeing that already, and that's what this illustrates, was these incident reports of these connections between these legacy drugs and fentanyl and stuff. Major takeaways, just to finalize here. Again, the future. This is, I guess, the present, really, in a way. But we're calling it the future of sorts, certainly as it relates to synthetic drugs. And there's a lot of modus operandi we think will be repeated. The elements of that is that it's obviously potent, so it can be moved in much smaller quantities. It's relatively easy to manufacture, so there are very low barriers of entry in that regard. Nothing that a wall will be able to stop, unfortunately. And as it relates to the groups, of course, we posited these couple theories, CJ and G, and then also the Sinaloa cartel. Those are very often the easy answers for us. That's a way to escape a larger debate about what to do, because we will, perhaps this is related to the earlier discussion about AMLO, we will say, if we eliminate those cartels, we will have eliminated the problem. Well, what we want to posit when we talk about these ancillary or subcontracted networks is that you're not going to eliminate the problem when you eliminate the Sinaloa cartel, whatever form that takes right now. We know that's also in transformation. So let's not fool ourselves in that regard. And then, of course, the idea of it being connected to these legacy drugs. In particular, our notion, and again, we'll have to see if this bears out over time, this what we think is a greater connection with methamphetamine than heroin, which isn't necessarily what you would think at first blush. And then finally, of course, there's huge black holes in our understanding. And I think probably the biggest one is we just don't know. We just can't assign a percentage of fentanyl that is coming direct from China into the United States versus what is coming via Mexico. So with that,
thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much. I always have admired very much your capacity, or the capacity that Inside Crime and all the collaborators have to understand the very complex world of organized crime and the criminal groups, the so-called drug trafficking organizations. These are really drug trafficking organizations with a little bit of they not necessarily all of them dedicate to drugs, but this is about drugs and it's very important. The reason why we're having this panel is because it's of prime importance, and I forgot to mention a key question here. There is an opioid crisis in the United States, and you could see with the graphs, and we're trying to see how to address this with two administrations that have very different agendas, it seems. And I have already some questions when I listen to your presentation that I will ask in the end. But it's great to have these two presentations, these two different approaches to the subject. This is an approach from the perspective of the drug trafficking organizations and the complexities that they involve. And this second presentation, I have here their amazing paper. The paper is titled "No More Opium for the Masses: From the U.S. Fentanyl Boom to the Mexican Opioid Crisis, Opportunities Amidst Violence." This is a fantastic paper that involves field research into very important regions, poppy producing regions of Mexico, in the state of Nayarit, the state of Guerrero, with many social problems that are of prime importance now for the Mexican government. And they propose ways to address this issue. So this combines very well because one sees these things at this level, and this other research sees this problem and the implications of these markets on others or more vulnerable populations. So this is a fantastic panel that combines two different visions. Thank you. This presentation, this paper was written by Romain Lecour. Romain is a PhD candidate at the Sorbonne University, visiting researcher at the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University, a LAVEX Step C Research Associate, a research fellow at the ERC Civil Wars, and a member of the Standing Group on Organized Crime, ECPR SGOC. Romain is co-authoring this paper with Nathaniel Morris. Nathaniel, who was here, is a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow attached to the History Department. He's researching the rise of indigenous vigilante groups in the context of the drug war currently racking Mexico, and the ties of history, memory, space, and culture that link these communal militias to the popular paramilitary forces that defeat the French invasion of Mexico in the 1860s. It's a very interesting approach that all these researchers have incorporated to the panel. And a third co-author of this paper who's not present, Benjamin Smith of the University of Warwick. Thank you and welcome to the Wilson Center.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guadalupe. Of course, first of all, thank you very much to the Mexico Institute and all the teams for the invitation, the support, and the co-production of the report with Noria Research. As Guadalupe was saying, we were actually three authors of the report with Benjamin Smith, who is a professor at the University of Warwick. Ben couldn't make it and extends, of course, his warmest regards to everybody. The report that you can find on all our three websites analyzes a slightly different angle of the crisis we're talking about, which is the socio-political effects of U.S. fentanyl boom on the opium and heroin local economy in Mexico. In so doing, I think our report shows that it is impossible to understand the Mexican context without the U.S. perspective and vice versa. In the international drug trade, local analysis must be articulated with broader regional and international perspective. And this report is based on a very rare moment, and we wanted to insist on that. In Mexico right now, opium and heroin production are not profitable anymore. The report is slightly different because it's based on the way we always work, the three of us, for the past 5 to 10 years or more in Mexico, which means doing field work. In this case, it means several weeks of field work that we conducted in the very poppy and heroin producing regions of Mexico with farmers, inhabitants, as well as drug traffickers, in order to analyze the impact of fentanyl use in the US on the price offered for raw opium and heroin in rural Mexico. As we will see, this is already having very serious social and economic effects in the country's poorest rural regions. Yet, this economic emergency and the outstanding fact that growing and producing certain drugs is no longer profitable might open up a chance to loosen the grip of criminal groups on the region's anti-farmers to illicit international market. The report and our presentation will address several possible solutions, including crop substitution and or opium legalization for medicine use, and evaluate how realistic they are in the Mexican context. Our report and the maps and the graphs that we've been producing combined data analysis, archives work, and insights directly taken from the fieldwork in 2019. In so doing, we hope to demonstrate the importance of conducting fieldwork in Mexico's most critical regions in order to shed light on the local socioeconomic dynamics of Mexican violence, allowing us to go way beyond most top-down analysis and demonstrate that there is no one miracle cure for the Mexico's opium crisis. And Nat will take it from here.
Thank you very much, Roman. Well, I'll get straight to the point. As a historian by trade, I'll start with a little bit of history, and I will try and not go over too much ground that you've already covered in terms of fentanyl and what it is. But we're talking about opium producers and the effects of fentanyl use in the US and this sort of boom on those producers. So to give you a little bit of context, the illicit cultivation of opium poppies in Mexico began in the 1920s, mainly in the Golden Triangle region of the Northwest, where the states of Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango all joined together. But the business only really started to boom from the early 1970s when the French connection that brought Asian heroin to the US via Europe collapsed, which spurred the massive expansion of opium production in Mexico to fill the void in the market. Changes in the US market resulted in changes on the ground in Mexico in the massive expansion of opium production. In the late 1970s, this first wave of opium production declined again due to changes in the US market, a shift towards cocaine as the new drug of choice, as well as Mexican sort of state-led repression, which was joined in by American organizations such as the DEA. Then, there's this ebb and this flow, and during the 1990s, similar mixtures of forces reignited Mexican opium production. First of all, in Mexico, neoliberal economic policies led to a decline in agricultural subsidies for Mexican peasants, and it increased price competitions for those small-scale Mexican farmers who had previously dedicated themselves to growing food crops. Some of them responded to these new pressures by migrating to Mexican cities, others left for the US, and many of those who stayed up in the most remote sort of countryside parts, the mountains of Mexico, turned to growing the only remaining profitable crops at this stage, which were poppies and marijuana. By the early 2000s, as you can see with this wonderful table behind me, the gradual legalization of marijuana in the US depressed the market for the Mexican product. Meanwhile, the number of US opioid addicts increased due to a conjunction of factors, including a massive uptake in legal prescriptions of opioids, thanks to the philanthropic Sackler family. And this pushed Mexican peasants into favoring poppies over marijuana as a primary cash crop. And the scale of this shift in Mexico is very clear to see thanks to the United Nations drug control data. So in 2000, the UNODC estimated that Mexicans' opium plantations covered around 1,900 hectares, produced about 41 tons of raw opium. By 2009, which is not coincidentally the year after Mexican corn subsidies were removed, this number had grown tenfold to 19,500 hectares, yielding 425 tons of raw opium. Now, recent estimates, with which the Mexican government is not officially in agreement with, are even higher. They show that around 32,000 hectares of poppies were being grown in 2016 in Mexico, and 44,100 hectares were being grown in 2017. Most of these poppy plantations are found in areas that still form a line running down from the Sierra Madre Occidental and the sort of the Golden Triangle region through to the southern, or the sort of the western states like Nayarit and parts of Jalisco, all the way down to Guerrero, Oaxaca, and even Chiapas. So the entire sort of west and south of the country is covered in these plantations. But the demand for opium has also driven poppy growing outside of these traditional hotspots. And a Mexican Ministry of Defense report claims that between 1995 and 2015, poppy plantations were found and destroyed in 18 out of Mexico's 32 states. Even more shocking is that there were 859 municipalities throughout the Republic where poppies were found growing, which is about 34% of the total municipalities of the country. So this is 1/3 of the country we're talking about is home to some kind of opium growing, which shows the scale and importance of the Mexican opium industry, which we estimate prior to 2016 channeled about 19 billion pesos, then worth around $1 billion, to some of the poorest and most marginalized communities in Mexico. And this is a vast amount of money we're talking about. I mean, it's nearly 3 times the total legal agricultural output of the entire state of Guerrero, for example. But this industry right now, and since last year when we did our fieldwork, is undergoing an unprecedented crisis, rooted, as usual, in shifts in the U.S. drug market, away from natural opioids like heroin, which is produced, after all, from the gum of this humble little flower, and towards synthetic opioids such as fentanyl. And for many years, fentanyl has been used in hospitals as an anesthetic for treating severe pain. Carfentanil was used as a rhino tranquilizer, very useful. But starting around 2014, more and more opioid addicts have turned to fentanyl. And as covered by the previous presentation, it's much stronger, so it's more profitable, it's easier to ship, and people make bigger profits from it. It's the power of the free market. The invisible hand is feeding people fentanyl at the moment. And this is reflected in the decreasing price of heroin on American streets, and in the massive rise in overdoses on American streets, from around 3,000 in 2013 to nearly 30,000 in 2017. But as well as leaving a bloody trail of dead consumers and fractured communities across the US, rising fentanyl use there has radically decreased the price paid for raw opium produced in rural Mexico, which is until recently the source of about 90% of the heroin consumed in the US. So in our paper, we used 2 case studies, one of a village in the Sierra Madre del Sur in Guerrero, and another of a village in northern Nayarit, to demonstrate the extent of this economic decline and to outline its broader socioeconomic effects. And extrapolating out from these examples, we argue that the fentanyl crisis in the US has resulted in a parallel opium crisis in rural Mexico. And this is a completely concrete and therefore quite rare example of how sudden changes in global markets can really hit communities on the ground at sort of micro local level. And more importantly, at least for the peasants who we were living with, it's a disaster because it's almost like the Mexican drug industry's subprime mortgage crisis. The bottom has just entirely dropped out of this market that was sustaining some of the poorest and most marginalized communities in all of Mexico. And this crisis, it's not only a massive crisis in the here and now in terms of people not being able to eat in Mexico, but it has the potential to rip apart the already damaged social fabric in 1/3 of Mexico's municipalities, which will have effect not just over all of the rest of Mexico's municipalities, but it will also be felt in the US and probably even further. So, first of all, I'll just go through case study A, which was my case study in northern Nayarit. And it's a village that's home to around 5,000 people, most of them indigenous, most of them highly marginalized. 91% live in poverty, officially. 61% in extreme poverty. 33.7% of the inhabitants are over 15 are illiterate. 51% of homes have no piped water. Local people have traditionally depended for their survival on subsistence agriculture, corn, beans, squash, on hunting and gathering. But from the mid-1980s onwards, local people also discovered opium, or rather, local teachers introduced opium to them. This enabled local people to supplement their subsistence agriculture with quite profitable commercial crop production, enabling them to buy alcohol, pickup trucks, medicines, modern cowboy clothing, cattle, stuff to build new houses with, and also to continue financing and in many cases step up the grandeur of the traditional rituals and celebrations around which village life and local culture kind of is completely centered. And so just as they had traditionally cultivated corn, the villagers sowed poppies in small plots carved using slash and burn techniques from the local forests, which also served to hide these illicit plantations from the prying eyes of the state. They sold the products on to the same local teachers who had originally given them the seeds. These teachers acted as mediators between the villagers and regional kind of drug trafficking organizations, if we will call them that. And it was these trafficking networks that took charge of processing the opium into heroin. People of Village A remained peasants, not drug technicians. A lot of people told me that they were making cocaine. They didn't even know that this stuff is turned into heroin. By early 2013, I estimate about 75% of local households were dependent for their annual cash incomes on illicit crop production. And at this point, the price of raw opium offered to these farmers was around 15,000 pesos, or $1,175 per kilo. So a single hectare plot, sort of 10 hours walk from the village, like up a mountain and in the forest, yields around 4 to 5 kilos of opium per season. There are 2 seasons in a year, so the average villager could be looking at income, net annual income of up to 75,000 pesos, so nearly $6,000, or even more than that if they increased their seasonal production, which is excellent money. It obviously came with problems, as the more that villagers became dependent on poppies, the more time they spent supervising their plots and neglecting their traditional agricultural pursuits. They were also increasingly vulnerable to attacks from the state forces, from the army, who rape and torture villagers with complete impunity, and also, members of the warring DTOs, who are essentially seen as, son los guachos y los sicarios, and they're armed men who come in and they do terrible things to the villagers. They're very much viewed in the same light. Also, as local merchants saw that peasants were getting rich, they started importing ever more alcohol, which led to a massive increase in, chronic alcoholism, domestic violence, and drunken, often lethal violence between heavily armed young men using their new AK-47s to shoot each other to pieces. But those who avoided arrest or murder or alcohol-related illness did continue to benefit from the growth in the price of raw opium. By 2017, opium prices reached a local peak of between 18,000 to 20,000 pesos. So that's around $1,000 per kilo. And so people could be expecting up to $10,000 per year if they cultivated sufficient opium on their little plots. But by mid-2018, this figure had fell to just this incredible, historic, all-time low of around 8,000 pesos, $420 per kilo, decline of more than 50% in a single year. And as a result, there's been a severe decline in the area of local land used to cultivate opium poppies, and a sharp uptake in the number of local people forced to leave the community to work outside, whether in nearby cities, on plantations on the Nayarit coast, or increasingly as wage laborers on poppy plantations elsewhere in Mexico, mainly in the Golden Triangle. So they've gone from being independent, autonomous poppy growers to being wage laborers working directly for drug trafficking organizations for subsistence wages of, maximum $10 a day. And, in these plantations, they live in unsanitary conditions, temporary labor camps, where they risk illness, violent abuse, and all the rest of it. And importantly, not only are people suffering as a result of this, but they're also becoming ever more distanced from the state as they become ever more reliant on DTOs for a basic subsistence income. And then they also become more disconnected from the local rituals around which life is completely sort of concentrated, which means traditional mechanisms of conflict resolution break down, and interpersonal violence, blood feuds, and all of the rest of that stuff kind of rises. So now Roman is going to talk about the second case study in Guerrero.
Thank you, Nat. We had a maps, different maps and graph and fieldwork pictures. Maybe we can show them afterwards, because I think that they're not on this document, and they would be very interesting for our purpose here. So my field case will take you to Guerrero Sierra Madre del Sur, which is a succession of small villages located on the crest of a mountain range and a region that forms a strategic commercial corridor that connects the Pacific coast of Guerrero with mainland highways that go north all the way up to the United States. The region I've been doing the fieldwork has been producing opium and heroin since at least the 1960s. Yet the massive current poppy cultivation in the area around the villages I did the fieldwork is heavily related to the second boom of the U.S. demand for heroin that occurred in the 2000s. This context also pushed traffickers to improve the quality of the heroin produced locally, moving from Mexico black tar to China white heroin. In terms of local dynamics, it appears that most of the male population in the area works in poppy production. Some of them participate as a secondary activity, helping a family member or a relative during peak times of the production, when labor force is most needed. This is especially true at the beginning of each productive season, which are 3 in Guerrero, when farmers need to clean and prepare the field for sowing, and 4 months later during harvest. But unlike in Village A, some local people also participate in the next phase, which is the transformation of opium paste into pure heroin. A local drug boss and his employees, including both men and women, control this process. Numbering from 50 to 100 individuals, according to the task at hand, they included armed men working as sicarios, women and men working as lookouts or halcones, and other local people, including children who help the drug boss in different daily activities. Most of these people, including the drug boss, were born and raised in the same area, and so the rest of the local population do not see them as a drug cartel per se, contrary to what most of the literature want to see in Mexico. So contrary to what has been observed and described in other areas of the country, in my villages, the poppy fields are not relegated to small patches on remote mountainsides, but they start right outside of the villages, sometimes as close as 100 meters from the main paved road. From there, they extend to cover most of the slopes in the area. During my fieldwork, I visited poppy fields that were only 15 minutes of easy walking away, as well as extensions that were more isolated and required several hours hiking. Why is it important? I think it allows to discuss common views of opium production holding that the practice is systematically hidden in remote, hostile, and inaccessible areas. Yet, here it must be noted that most of the poppy fields are not really hidden, first, and that most of them were visible from a considerable distance away, especially when the poppy flowers were in bloom and covered the sierra in thousands of red dots. It's also crucial to mention that this part of the municipalities where I did the fieldwork and this part of Guerrero hosts not only one but several semi-permanent army bases, which are located on top of hills and allow soldiers to patrol the area day and night. Second, it illustrates one crucial aspect of the social dynamics of violence in Mexico, the social embeddedness of drug trade and activities. Contrary to what most of macroanalysis tends to convey, in the Sierra Madre del Sur in Guerrero, drug production, and especially natural drug production, meaning poppy production and turning it into chemics, is rooted in very strong and very local social dynamics when the entire production chain is concentrated in the villages, from poppy and opium-based extraction to heroin production in the local labs. And to say it in a very rapid way, in those villages, everybody knows everybody. So the drug trade is not a secret activity. It's rather the absolute opposite, sorry. The local drug boss here assumes the role of the acaparador, which is the term they use, literally the grabber or the gatherer. This designates the person who is simultaneously able to offer protection to the local farmers and growers and assure them that that the business will run as a closed economy. It relies on the assurance for growers and that the acaparador will buy their production, as long as they respect a certain level of purity and quality of the opium paste, and the assurance for the local boss, through a regime of coercion and protection, that he will be able to produce heroin on a constant basis. Then the acaparador sells the pure heroin that went from bad quality black tar to higher product of China white to a bigger organizations which are capable of transporting it and distributing it to the United States. But the local dimension of the production and the trade has decisive implications for the drugs economy. Since more than 95% of the local male population is involved in poppy production, it ensures, when the market is up, a constant economic bonanza for the entire region. This was true until mid-2017 and the start of the opium crisis, when a local farmer in this part of Guerrero could make around $4,000 a year through poppy cultivation, and the farmers who had much more economic capital to invest, especially in order to recruit day laborers, buy machines, and install complex irrigation systems, could make around $10,000 a year. Then the crisis hit. In this part of Guerrero, between 2017 and 2018, the price of opium fell by almost 80%. So these two case studies raise a series of important questions. Do they reflect broader trends in the Mexican countryside? If so, where? Have these other regions witnessed a similar downward trend in the price paid for opium? And finally, what are the potential national effects of the opium crisis? Of course, answering some of these questions fully requires further research in Mexico. Yet, our information collected in the two regions can be supplemented with data from informants in other key opium-producing regions of Mexico, such as the Golden Triangle or the Mixteca regions in Oaxaca. They all show one very clear trend. Opium prices are on the decline, and the effect is on a very large scale. The value of opium crop in 2017 was probably around $1 billion a year. More tellingly, the value of opium crop in Mexico in 2017 outstripped the entire value of agricultural output in 26 of Mexico's 32 states. In this context, our report demonstrates the radical decrease in the value of the opium crop over the past year and a half. In 2018, Mexican opium farmers have probably made around $300 million from opium production, which suggests a decrease of earning in the poorest areas of Mexico of as much as 60%. This economic consequences are extremely bad, and they are extremely visible today in Mexico. The first option for the opium growers was migration, either to the Mexican cities or to the U.S. The migration to the U.S. today is extremely difficult. The second option of survival was growing opium, and it's could be about to disappear. And Nat will address certain of the solutions that have been presented, and then we will drop the conclusions. And thank you for the maps.
So this prognosis is pretty bad, but the current opium crisis may also provide opportunities to move some of the poorest regions of Mexico away from their dependency on illicit crops, and in so doing, wrest control of these areas from drug trafficking networks. So there are two main kind of solutions that have been proposed, and they've both been around for a while. But with this current crisis, they're suddenly becoming somewhat realistic. One of these is legalization and regulation of opium production that would funnel currently illicit production into a legal market for the Mexican health system. The other one is crop substitution, giving peasants money and assistance to switch the production to legal crops, and there's been a lot of words expended on both of these projects, and there's a lot of kind of optimism in some sectors about them, and we think there are real grounds for some of this optimism, but we need to make it completely clear that neither of these options is a kind of silver bullet miracle solve-all solution to the problems of the Mexican countryside, and in particular to the problems of Mexico's opium growers. For a start, legalization and regulation, AMLO's been talking about it. The governor of Guerrero 2 years ago was talking about it. Former presidents have jumped on the bandwagon, think tanks, the new Minister of the Interior, even the Mexican military is suddenly talking about it. In 2018, Guerrero's state congress sent an initiative to the Senate asking for this legalization to be locally implemented, and that is now being studied by Mexican bureaucrats in various federal institutions. And so the proposed benefits of legalization include that it would bring in considerable amounts of money to opium-growing communities. It would offer tax returns to the government, offer legal jobs for the people in Guerrero, both in opium farming and possibly even in the manufacture of morphine and other pharmaceuticals from that opium. It would provide morphine for Mexican health infrastructure, which still imports the drug from outside and suffers shortages of legal opioids, and it would diminish the influence of DTOs and, as a result, endemic violence in the Mexican countryside. But, first of all, there are some pretty big legal barriers to change, both in Mexico and in the United Nations system. The second is really big, and unless there's real change at global level, it's unlikely that a Mexico-only legalization program will really solve that many problems. There can be no unique Mexican response to this issue, is what we're saying. International norms would need to be revised in order for a Mexican regulation of opium production to be sustainable and comprehensive. Second, the link between legalization and decreasing violence is overly simplistic, because much of the violence in Mexico today is less about drugs per se and more an extension of broader social, political, economic problems: judicial impunity, political competition, police corruption, kidnapping, extortion, illegal logging and other resource harvesting, mining, unresolved blood feuds. And there are pretty important queries over whether legal production of opium would affect all but a small quantity of opium growing areas and opium producers, because If we take the most conservative estimates, Mexico imports currently only 0.7 tons of morphine, and that would require only 7 tons of Mexican opium to produce. And that's not very much. A single village could supply all that. Others claim that Mexico requires more. We estimate that maybe 21% of Mexico's current opium production could be funneled into legal channels. But clearly this is not like a catch-all solution. Crop substitution has also been bandied about a lot. But as we've seen in Colombia currently and from many other crop substitution programs, it's really difficult. It takes a huge amount of money and it takes a huge amount of political investment, and often that's just not there. And this means that it has constantly failed to bring about real change. In Colombia right now, the amount of coca being grown has actually increased despite substitution programs. And if anything similar were to be done in Mexico, it would not only require money and political will, but it would require the government to completely change its standard top-down approach to rural development. It would require full local comprehensive consultation with local communities, with every local community that is a stakeholder in the opium production that is currently going on, because every area is different. Hay muchos Méxicos. And in the same way, there are many, many, many opium producing communities that, as we've shown with our case studies, are very different. That said, because the bottom's dropped out of this market, poppies are no longer profitable, and peasants will, for the first time in 10 or even 20 years, be receptive to the idea of growing something else. Because, these people are not stupid. They've survived in pretty harsh places for centuries. They know what is sensible and what is not. And currently, opium, it's not a sustainable business model. So, there is an opportunity here. And to conclude, I will very quickly...
Yeah, well, I will be very, very, very brief. I think the first key point of the report is that the crisis is still ongoing in Mexico. So it is still a crucial opportunity to alter the control of de facto authorities controlling these regions, be they organized crime, political bosses, or a combination of both. Yet, criminal groups, as well as their political partners in Mexico, are fiercely adaptable to change. Of course, they have shown their ability to dominate territories through other industries, including other illegal activities, but also legal activities, including agricultural activities, which was the case, for example, of the avocado trade in Michoacán. Moreover, our report shows the importance of acknowledging and researching the social embeddedness of drug trafficking in Mexico again. My colleagues and I believe that the words narcos, cartels, tend to oversimplify what's at stake in Mexico, as well as to hide the multiplicity of social dynamics of violence in the country. In most of the places where we have been conducting fieldwork for the past 5 to 10 years, local people never use the term drug cartel. But they know the traffickers by their names. In fact, everybody knows everybody, and the Mexican proverb, pueblo chico, infierno grande. The traffickers are part of the communities. It's family, friends, people you like, you hate, you fear, you respect, you admire. In any case, you can't avoid them. So the solutions that are imagined to solve the drug issues in Mexico cannot pretend that criminal organizations are external actors to the societies in which they're active. The crucial point here is social embeddedness of drug trafficking in Mexico. We will continue to talk about drug cartels as a magic word that blinds much diverse situations. It is crucial to understand that criminal groups are not autonomous. They're embedded in local specific typologies of political power in which spaces and modes of governance, social control, and rent extraction are negotiated every day. So the problem is not just farmers, and the problem is not just narcos. The entire economy is organized around the drug trade. But it also goes into a question of political economy, since it includes corruption, clientelism, bossism, impunity, and social repression. Of course, as we said, legalization and crop substitution have been presented as possible alternatives, and this requires further research. Actually, resolving this crisis and the rest of the crisis in Mexico requires further in-depth, policy-focused research in Mexico. And despite an infinite number of public or private initiatives in the past 12 years, Mexico keeps adding up historically violent years. So while the violence rises, more studies are produced. And yet, both public strategies and policy analysis are still characterized by most of top-down macro-level approaches, increasing the gap between the local realities of the field and the violence in the country and the responses to them. To put it differently, today we don't really know what's going on in local Mexico. And we believe that these trends produce a lack of knowledge and understanding on the local specificities of violence, security, and governance in local Mexico. So we believe it is urgent to design policies that are based on solid, updated knowledge about local dynamics of violence in the country. Any political response must be based on further research and diagnosis conducted in the most critical opium-producing regions of the country in this context. After more than 12 years of drug war in Mexico, we think that it is urgent to articulate fieldwork research with policy design in order to come up with different and innovative approaches. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Romain. These are excellent. This is an excellent presentation. I mean, it's an excellent panel, as I said, two different approaches that reflect the complexities that we're facing today. And the contradictions that we will see. And I really thought that this phrase that you mentioned, the war is over, but the war is coming whether we want it or not, is really important, and it was perfect. And to start this discussion with that phrase, it's true, and I can see here two different visions. The vision from the DTOs, this is the policy of the United States, which you very well described, and there are political interests to address this issue in a certain way, versus this other approach from the bottom. We're talking about opioids, right? We're talking about, in one regard, fentanyl, the involvement of China and Mexico through the borders, and some policies that are now in the public sphere. But really, the other version of this is very complicated. We have had 12 years of a so-called drug war. The drug is, as you say, the war is over, because according to what I interpret, because I don't know how to figure that out, what Andrés Manuel López Obrador said, the war is over. What does that mean? I thought that what was over is exactly what the United States government is pushing forward, which is dealing with the drug trafficking organizations in the traditional way. There was last year a meeting in Chicago already. I mean, not with the current authorities, but I hope that they were there. And it was very clear what the United States government is pushing forward, versus sometimes the needs of these communities. If you crack the two cartels, if hypothesis one is the one that it's proven to be real, you're going to see fragmentation of these groups, and it's going to be very complicated for those communities if that happens. And if the war is really over, we're going to see a confrontation between the two countries and stopping collaboration. I don't know. I want to know something, and these are my questions. How much is the fentanyl market, I mean, the portion that Mexico, if you have an idea, of course you don't know, this is an illicit market, right? How much of this comes from Mexico? How important Mexico is for the fentanyl market? And with regards to heroin and fentanyl inside Mexico, and this is a question for both of you, what's more important for Mexico? Is fentanyl or heroin? What we're talking about here? This is one thing which is very important for policy issues. And another thing, how do you see these two approaches that seem to be very contradictory, and the future of the cooperation between the United States and Mexico to address these issues that affect, on the one hand, the United States with an opioid crisis, and on the other hand, communities that might have to. There's an opportunity here, but there are many challenges as well. What your paper is dealing with, there's so many challenges that you already explain, but I see even more considering this other factor. So I would like to hear your perspectives of these very open-ended questions, but I would like to know how important is Mexico really in this market, because it seemed that when cocaine is an issue, we have a problem, right? And these groups move and are so dynamic that in the end, they go where the business is. But I want to know, because maybe fentanyl comes from a different part, I don't know. And the problem that we have has to do with poppy seed growers that are going to be transforming their activities. Thank you.
Okay. You want to start?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I mean, the first thing as to whether the war is over or not, I'm going to be blunt about this. I don't know what the president meant. And I don't think that the president knows what he meant, to be completely honest. And I'm not saying this lightly. I'm not trying to make fun of him. I mean, he was the Hawks not shooting candidate, abrazos, no balazos. And he then became the president, the responsible president towards the militarization strategy with the Guardia Nacional. And he's now saying that basically they're not going to be chasing El Chapo and all the big cartel names. But I'm pretty sure he hasn't run it with the military, because the military are extremely dedicated to the special target strategy, and the Navy is still as well. I mean, I spoke with them yesterday. So what we're seeing here is this conflict between the rhetoric of a president that has been changing his mind a lot in the past few weeks with the actual inertia of the Mexican security establishment, which is much devoted to the special target strategy, and which is a lot dependent on more kinetic actions, if you will. Big helicopters, big interventions, big army, banging down doors. And even if there was a coherent strategy or plan to bring it back from that kind of approach, well, we haven't seen any signs of that. I mean, the national security strategy they presented, I mean, as our previous colleagues, I mean, they commented on it. I mean, it's basically a collection of, it's a hodgepodge of half-baked ideas. I mean, to be completely factual about it. So right now, I mean, I would say, in specific terms, no, we don't know. We don't know. I mean, we can expect that most of the Mexican security establishment will continue to work with the American security establishment, as they have been doing for the past 20 years, regardless of the political leadership. There's a lot of personal connections, a lot of work that has been invested in it. And it is the kind of bureaucratic resilience that keeps things going through the years. I mean, we kind of expected, for example, the Trump administration, that some sort of major seismic change in U.S. Mexico cooperation. It didn't happen. Because again, it runs on the ground. As Roman and Ned were saying, I mean, some things are actually being run on the ground. Not necessarily for the best, but they are being run on the ground. So I figured that would continue. And as to how much is Mexico's fentanyl worth for the American market? The truth is, we don't know. I mean, we still have a huge debate amongst the team. I mean, amongst the research team, because. For example, in my case, I advocate for the view that the Mexican cartels, the Mexican organizations and the networks, they have no real economic advantage in producing fentanyl. A Chinese average plant can outproduce all the Mexican groups so damn fast. And if you can send things through the United States or through Canada, as they have been doing, then the value of having a land route for fentanyl, I mean, this is what Maria was mentioning cocaine. There was value for a land route in cocaine after they closed the Caribbean route. I mean, that was what created the modern Mexican cartels. There is no value in fentanyl, I mean, for a land route. So it's not like they're extremely competitive, which brings us to the other point, and this is something you also have to bear in mind. I mean, there is a credible hypothesis right now in Mexico that the major cartels are a thing of the past. I mean, it's not like we're in the baby cartel epoch of the Colombians would claim that they are. But simple fact is that we just don't see the big cartels anymore. I mean, CGNG, I mean, it's supposed to be like the hair. Well, if it is, it's a very diminished one. I mean, geographically, in terms of capabilities, in terms of actual deployment, Yeah, no.
Yeah.
So the whole, it's not just that the poppy growers are in crisis. The whole Mexican narco economy is in crisis.
Yeah.
And this is a worrisome fact because it hasn't been incorporated in any significant policy diagnostic. I mean, and if it is happening, as you so correctly mentioned, I mean, if we're already living in the fragmented post-cartel world, then nobody's acknowledging it. The strategy is not adjusting. And that goes as to how important is fentanyl for the Mexican underground economy right now. Well, it's a disruptor. I mean, it's causing major havoc. But everybody we spoke with basically estimated that as a significant source of income, it's still not. I mean, it's still a minor source of income. Basically because, again, they're not that competitive.
Right. Excellent.
Yeah, just to add to that, just there's a key point in this, which is the fentanyl that they're finding that comes via Mexico is about 7% pure, and the fentanyl they're getting from China is 95% pure. So they're also very often you'll see in the CBP statistics they'll measure it the same way. So you'll get a kilo of fentanyl from Mexico will look the same way as a kilo from China when obviously they're not. There's 10 times difference there. So that's a very important point in terms of like the synthetic drug industry. What is the role on the local level? And by the way, great presentation, and I look forward to reading the paper. There is none. I mean, this is the thing. This is part of the disruption that synthetic opioids presents. There's no. You're not creating a labor pool. You're not creating these chains of distribution. You're not there. There isn't any. So So it has this disruptive effect as they noted on the very local level, but all the way through the chain of distribution and going back again to low barriers of entry, slow destruction of the old paradigm.
Right. Nathaniel, Romain, we have 15 minutes, and I would like to gather some questions from the audience because David is here, and we also want to listen to what he wants to say. So I'm gonna gather some questions from the audience, and if you want to, to respond to my questions in very, very general terms, let's do it after I ask this question.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you very much. Okay, Chris, and here, these two people, and I'm gonna gather 3 questions, and then we can continue two sets of questions. Okay, Chris.
Thanks very much, Guadalupe. I'm with the Mexico Institute here, Chris Wilson, and thanks to everyone for the excellent presentations. Looking at the figures that were put up of seizure data, what strikes me is that aside for this brand new increase of fentanyl trafficking, and a decrease in marijuana trafficking in terms of seizures, I actually don't see these new trends that you're describing, this massive change in the criminal landscape in Mexico. I don't even see changes in the amount of heroin coming into the United States across the southwest border. And clearly there's something on the ground in terms of the value of production of heroin in Mexico that's happening. But help me square those two things if you can. Why is it that the same levels of heroin are being trafficked across the border, yet the value of it to producers in Mexico is changed dramatically? And can we really be so confident that the criminal landscape will dramatically alter in terms of because of this rise of fentanyl? If cocaine is still so popular and if some of these other drugs are still remaining popular?
Great question.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Erasmo Soto with Parents Alliance. As a result of what you have been discussing today, my question is, how are Chinese DTOs profiting and seizing this opportunity that has been created for them in Mexican territory, and how that poses a risk to the United States?
Yes.
Hi, thank you all. Logan Pauly with C4ADS. This question is probably more for Stephen and Jaime, but I think you guys were astute to point out that it's hard to discern how much fentanyl is coming in to the U.S. either from China or from Mexico. But I wanted to ask you guys a little bit more about the supply chain on how exactly Mexico is getting its fentanyl in the first place. Do you see that Mexico is relying on buying already produced fentanyl from China, or do you see that Mexico is buying precursor chemicals from China? Or do you ever see that Mexico itself is producing its own precursor chemicals like MPP or otherwise?
Thank you. I maybe the three questions have to do with, with Steve and Jaime, but Nathaniel and Romain might be able to respond from the other perspective, right? How this is going to affect your, that this will address my question as well. Thank you.
Sure.
I think Chris's was also about the price.
Yeah.
Certainly, Romain and Nathaniel.
You guys want to take the price thing? No, go for it. Okay. Well, on the first thing, how can we ensure that this is a major change? Well, it's not strictly related to fentanyl. That's just the thing. What you have to bear in mind is that the boom-bust cycle for agricultural illegal products, agricultural-based illegal products, it tends to bring about tectonic shifts. The whole report by Nathaniel and Nat and Romain, what it shows is that basically a lot of people jump into the wagon of producing at one point. And minor disruption in the market, fentanyl might be a major player, but even a minor disruption, it's going to bring a lot of these people down. It happened with the tequila boom, for example. And that was a legal product. A lot of people started producing tequila. It's a 7-year cycle product. And a minor disruption in the market, a minor switch to, I think it was vodka or rye whiskey, something like that. We're talking about a 5% dip. Sent to bankruptcy hundreds of people in Jalisco. So, and that's why I emphasize so much that the major organizations, the cartels, the thing is cartels were supposed to be able to deal with this kind of disruptions. That's the whole concept of a cartel. You control the market. You control the supply, you control the prices, you control the distribution. That's why we keep insisting that these people are not cartels. They are extremely vulnerable to changes. Now, if the imports remain roughly the same levels, the thing is, and this is where the cabinet emptor goes in, seizures are not equivalent, they do not have a direct relationship to actual traffic. So, we can see some variations that are being hidden in the figures, in the estimates as to how much product is entering. Even then again, our best explanation in trying to square this out is basically because a minor disruption can have a huge impact in the market. These are extremely vulnerable organizations. These organizations that usually do not operate with huge cash reserves, for example. A couple of failed shipments can bring down an entire organization. We saw it in Colombia. We saw it in Mexico. So we're not talking about resilient, ongoing concerns. We're talking about rather vulnerable networks here. So that would be that's our approach, that's our best explanation for that. And the second one is that how the Chinese DTOs benefit. From a report and our research, the fact that everything goes through Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas shows a deep connection. The deep and traditional, decades spanning connection between the Chinese DTOs and the Mexican DTOs. And again, what one has to remember is that Chinese DTOs do not look the traditional part. Chinese DTOs include chemical engineers who do a first shift at their factories, for example. Or people who go through a series of fronts to getting their merchandise. And this has been decades-old relationship. Shen Yegon, which is probably the most notorious case of a Chinese national in Mexico, he actually had a legitimate front. It wasn't even a front, it was a real factory. It was a real factory, and the first shift was the key to producing the precursors. And that is, Shen Yegon was already 10, 15 years old case. Mm-hmm. So very little has changed. And the way they're benefiting is pretty much the same they've always have. And goes to the house of Mexico, gets its fentanyl, does it make it? It varies. As Steve commented and as we show in the report, you can find cases of all three. People who are importing...
Well, we haven't seen them making fentanyl yet.
Or just this Mexico City bust.
From precursors, they're making the fentanyl, but there's not them making the precursors and then making the fentanyl. And we don't know because we have such a small sample size in terms of the laboratory seizures. It's hard for us to say, is it coming in precursor? Is it coming in pure? There was a case the other day that they captured what was pure, and it arrived at the airport. It's just such a small amount that you need that, it's just so hard to wrap our hands around how big it is, the relationship. There was, again, this question keeps coming back. What percentage is coming direct? We don't know. I mean, that's where we are with all this. There are certain data points that we're plucking out in terms of trying to understand the role of the cartels. And again, we're talking about monolithic structures. The DEA itself in its last report said that there was no Mexican strategy to put the fentanyl into the other drugs, even though they're sending it in polydrug samples. So you're getting polydrug shipments, but the Mexicans are leaving it out. They're letting the end distributors in the United States slip in those little dosages of fentanyl so that the local users are becoming more addicted. So again, are they controlling it, from point A to point Z? We don't think so. So that's, just sort of little data points like that. And then the last thing I would just mention is India. Another traditional producer. They had their first, at least publicly acknowledged seizures, and there were 3 Mexicans with the person who was seized with the fentanyl. So we, of course, that's the next wave we would expect, is that it would start being produced in India.
Okay, thank you. Nathaniel,
just
Romain.
might add up something to what you just said, and maybe you want to go on. Regarding your question on the effect in the U.S., we produced this, and we actually took the data from the U.S. You see how heroin without fentanyl goes down and heroin with fentanyl goes up. So basically, there is less heroin or pure heroin in the U.S. that is being consumed. That's already the case. And then you have the heroin wholesale prices in the U.S. has been going down and down and down. So there is actually the effect of this in the U.S. and simultaneously in Mexico. I think it's almost like economic crisis 101. Basically, it's like you have this decrease in demand, you have the decrease in prices, and you have an economic crisis in the production areas. Regarding the transformation of the criminal organizations in Mexico, I think it's not. And I agree with what Jaime was saying. I think it's not a recent trend. I mean, I think what's more recent is that somehow we're trying to acknowledge the fact that those criminal organizations are extremely various, and that they don't belong to one typical model of drug cartel as I don't know, like a movie would present it. It's like Guerrero has nothing to do with Nayarit, honestly. Sinaloa, the mountains of Sinaloa has nothing to do with Colima, for example. And we don't know why Colima became, of course we know that Manzanillo is in Colima and Lázaro Cárdenas is in Michoacán, but why Colima has become so dangerous, so violent, and now Juárez is not violent, we say it's the drug route. All right, I think it's kind of a tautological reflection on, we see decrease in trends, so we try to figure out what's going on, but we should try to be more on the other side of the reflection and see what's going on the ground, so we can try to understand why the violence is going up. So why is it important that violence is going up for homicide trends? All right, but I've been doing fieldwork in Michoacán for 5 years in regions where homicide trends are extremely low, because the region is actually controlled by a very powerful drug group that manages to keep the levels of violence very low. So we say, Arteaga or Aguililla in Michoacán never show up in any trends of violent regions, and still, honestly, when you're there, it's not a very quiet place. But no one is reporting homicide, so there is no homicide, so you don't make it to the homicide figures. And the last thing regarding India, and I think it's very interesting to what you were saying just before, in Michoacán, where the Lázaro Cárdenas port is located, in the past, let's say 5 to 10 years, Indian actors were extremely powerful through one major figure, which we all know, who is Mr. Mittal. And Mr. Mittal used to work with the Caballeros Templarios, the Knight Templars, to extract illegal iron from Michoacán to re-export it at a very, very interesting price to India. So I think that the fact that we see India or Indian actors becoming important in that fentanyl crisis today is probably something that has been going on for a long time, because India was sending chemicals to Michoacán, and Michoacán was sending iron to India.
India.
So I think
Italy,
it's
Slovenia.
probably,
You're
it's
absolutely right.
it's
Yeah.
probably
So, yes, so Nathaniel, probably we have to finish we have to finish soon. So the last
Yeah.
intervention,
Well, so
and we close the panel.
I can be very quick in summing up. I guess my response to all of these questions is give us some money and we can go and find out. But, it's all about doing the field work and doing the research, and the more of that we do, the more answers we'll have. So I'm here all day. You'll find me loitering outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this great panel. Thank you all for being here. Just let me congratulate our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Guadalupe. If you could all just hold tight for about 10 more minutes, David Shirk will come up to the panel and the table and give his insights. Thank you all. You guys can... And I do want to announce that while we were talking, news came across the wires that Chapo Guzman has been found guilty, and that the jury said they knew we were discussing these things, and there was no hope. So I think it all had to do with our proceedings here. All seriousness aside, I just want to introduce really briefly a great friend, colleague, David Shirk. He is the associate professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of San Diego, a global fellow here at the Wilson Center, and a visiting professor at UCSD, University of California, San Diego, School of International Relations and Pacific Studies. He also directs a couple of other initiatives, most notably in my book, Justice in Mexico Research Project, that's been doing a lot of great research on the justice sector, police, and other aspects of justice reform in Mexico. So, David, we didn't want to, I know it wasn't your fault to get hung up in Newark in bad weather, but we're delighted you're here. We wanted to give you a few minutes to wrap things up, and that will be our final presentation. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. We actually had mechanical issues in our plane last night leaving San Diego, and then the weather this morning with ice on the plane. And so I texted ahead and said I wasn't going to make it, and said I'll just sit and listen. And they said that I had to still come up and talk, or they were going to punish me. So you have to work for your food here at the Wilson Center. Just a couple of final remarks. I mean, one of the things that was really striking, I did get to, while I was sitting on the plane listening to watching the de-icing going on, through the magic of the internet, I was able to see the introductory remarks by Eric, listen to Edna's comments, and Enrique's as well. Unfortunately, I didn't get to hear, but for the end of Tony's comments. But I wanted to just take up a couple of the themes that I thought were so important about today's discussion. First is obviously this issue of this period of unparalleled crisis that we've reached. We've been looking at these issues for a very long time, collaborating with the Wilson Center since 2009 when I was a fellow here, and of course many of us doing a lot of work on these topics since the 90s or early 2000s. And what's, I think, frustrating is that we're looking at an ongoing public security crisis in Mexico that's now basically into its third decade, right? But it's reached this fever pitch where it's not only what's happening in Mexico, but also what's happening in the United States. This last year we saw 30,000 people die in Mexico as a result of some of these security concerns, and of course the tens of thousands of people who died last year in the United States due to drug overdoses, and surely that will die again this year. And I think one of the things that a lot of the discussion focused on, are we doing the right thing in response? What do we think about Guardia Nacional, et cetera? But we haven't really talked much about what's been driving the increase. When we were here 3 or 4 years ago, we were talking about the fact that things were looking a little bit better as rates of violence declined from 2000 11 and 12 to more moderate levels in 2014. And of course, what we saw in late 2014 and into the present is this sort of resurgence of violent crime. And we haven't really, in today's discussion, as far as I can tell, and I'm not sure anyone has yet, really figured out what's the theory of causation here, right? Enrique asked, what's López Obrador's theory of change? Well, to have a theory of change, you have to have some assumptions about what it is that's causing the problem that you're trying to deal with. And I'm not sure we as experts, as a community of thoughtful people, have really figured out what's the answer here. And there are a number of hypotheses, right? One is this hypothesis that has been really the narrative, the central narrative of the drug war for many years, which is hypothesis one. What we're seeing, what drives up violence is the conflicts between relatively well-consolidated major criminal organizations. And arguably that's been an important part of the equation over the last couple of decades. When you arrest someone like Chapo Guzman, extradite him to the United States, and eventually sentence him at least find him guilty, as we have today, that causes a power vacuum that leads to infighting within his organization, encroachment from other organizations like the New Generation Cartel. So that's one possible part of the explanation. A second hypothesis is that, in fact, we've done this so many times, we've taken out so many kingpins, that we've actually seen the fragmentation of criminal organizations to such an extent that violence is relatively constant and rampant in many different sectors of illicit activity and across many different parts of the country. This sort of chaos hypothesis of fragmentation leading to these elevated levels of violence is arguably also a very compelling explanation. And perhaps even both of these things could be true at the same time. But I think to understand what might work, we have to think about what are which of these drivers do we think is most important, what's really happening here. And I'm going to just push back a little bit on some of the concerns raised in the first panel, and also bring in some of the thoughts from the second panel. It may be that we are actually experiencing or witnessing a major shift in the drug policy regime. And if that's true, if legalization of marijuana, which we just started to see play out in the policy arena 10 years ago, when I was first a fellow here, sitting in those seats, I remember asking what we thought of the possibility of drug legalizations in the United States, and everyone was like, that's politically non-viable. Right. That same fall, we voted in California with a narrow loss to possibly legalize marijuana, and within a year or two, we saw several states begin this process of marijuana legalization, and of course, several countries, notably Portugal and Canada, Uruguay, have taken their own paths to try to pursue that particular approach. And that's one thing that's really striking to me about the new government of López Obrador. As much as we might, I think, rightfully criticize the López Obrador administration, one of the motifs or sort of consistent themes that's coming up throughout this administration, for the first time in a sitting administration, well, you can sort of count Peña Nieto's speech to the UN, but really this is the first time that you have a sitting president who I think is seriously considering what needs to be done to move towards a public health regime for drug consumption. Partly that's mandated by the Mexican Supreme Court, which has now found that Mexicans do have a right to possess and consume marijuana. They've just got to figure out the tricky bit of how that gets supplied and distributed, or produced and distributed. So something is happening in the drug policy world that is a change, a major, I think to use Stephen's word, a disruption that has almost nothing to do with López Obrador, but he may well be the conduit of a major policy shift in Mexico, and that might be a good thing, right? not only in the sense that we would move towards a public health regime, but also if indeed he is able to live up to his word and not continue to take down major kingpins like Chapo Guzman, he may well succeed in doing exactly what he has promised in terms of the pacification approach to dealing with drugs, focusing on other things. The second thing that López Obrador brings to the table that we really haven't seen in any seriousness in the past 3 presidential administrations, maybe the last several presidential administrations dating back all the way to the mid-20th century, is I think a sincere, whether you like his approach or not, but a sincere commitment to social justice and trying to address the socioeconomic roots of violent crime. And the flagship initiative that everyone's talking about since January is this program to provide becas and tutorials or internships for the so-called ninis, the people who neither study nor are currently employed, young people ages 18 to 29. There hasn't been a really serious focus, at least not at a large national level. There's been some great experiments by U.S. government and Mexican programs to try to address those socioeconomic issues. And the fact that López Obrador is trying to take the model that he used in Mexico City in terms of expanding educational and work opportunities and take that national, I think that's laudable. And I think it may have some very positive effects. What I do worry about personally is whether or not that really addresses all of the systemic factors that lead to a life of violent crime. It's not just the monetary deficits that we see that prevent students from going to high school or going into college in Mexico, but rather it's other more serious and much more intractable kinds of problems like domestic violence and substance abuse in the home that lead to the kind of social dislocation that contributes to long-standing problems of violence and delinquency. And we haven't yet seen a set of policies from this administration or any other really to try to address those issues. The third and final aspect of López Obrador's approach is this approach of or what he's going to inevitably do, I think, in this next 6 years, is a major bureaucratic restructuring in Mexico. We've already seen that to a certain extent with changes that predated him in terms of creation of a new Fiscalía General and the appointment of Alejandro Gertz Manero as the head of that agency. How that Fiscalía is developed is going to be critically important. How are they going to subdivide the subprocuradurías? Or subfiscalías? How are they going to shape that industry and what priorities they set within that agency? It's going to be hugely important for how the war on drugs is waged over the next few years. So whether we like it or not, López Obrador is going to have a major impact. His thumbprint is going to be huge in what happens next in Mexican public security. But add to that the recreation of the Secretaría de Seguridad Pública y Protección Ciudadana, the new SSPC. It's such a terrible acronym. Is it SSPPC? It's terrible. They need to hire me to do their acronyms because I know it's going to be really hard to say. But we're going to see inevitably major changes taking place as a result of this new agency and new focus. Personally, I don't like, and I agree with Edna on this, I think it's a very dangerous thing to begin this process of centralization, both through the delegates, the state-level delegates from the federal government, but also through the creation of more centralized more centralized public security entities. But that's the knee-jerk reaction of any national-level official to a complex problem. You get attacked on 9/11, what do? You centralize all your agencies, right? You try to rein in control because you don't like complexity and you don't like feeling a lack of accountability on the part of the entities that you need to work with to try to address that complex problem. that brings me to the Guardia Nacional in particular. I agree with Edna, a very frightening potential and very probable outcome of this administration is the move towards a Guardia Nacional. To me, that's like way worse than a gendarmeria. Gendarmerie, which was proposed in the previous administration. It duplicates functions and in some ways makes them worse from what we had with a Policía Federal insofar as it now adds this quasi-military status. And I think we'd be much better off if we saw Mexico investing in continuing to professionalize the federal police. But I think the best that we can hope for is to see the kind of lobbying efforts that Mexico Evalúa is doing to try to pressure the AMLO government to make that entity as accountable as possible. Ideally shifting the lines of administrative authority to a civilian and budgetary authority to a civilian entity. But ultimately, what are we dealing with here? Are we dealing with disruption or continuity? It's certainly, I think, a frightening prospect to think about the impact of fentanyl and the major changes, the major shifts that we're seeing in the drug trade, a fundamental restructuring of the drug trade, not only in Mexico but worldwide because of the invention of, or the expansion of the use of fentanyl. But after 20 years of looking at this myself, after 40 years of, 40, almost 50 years of since Nixon declared the drug war. I was born that year, so it's approaching 50. But as we've seen this whatever it is, this paradigm wear on, one thing that strikes me is the incredible continuity. As long as there is a voracious appetite for a prohibited substance here in the United States, increasingly in Europe, and increasingly in Mexico, we're going to have a very, very hard time trying to combat it. But there are also other constants that people have pointed out. The constants of continuity, despite the emergence of disruptors like López Obrador or Donald Trump, we see continued collaboration between U.S. and Mexican government agencies, between civil society entities like the Wilson Center and Mexico Evalúa. And for me, those are the bright spots, because we've actually seen through that kind of cooperation and through commitment to improving the rule of law in Mexico, we've actually had some wins. We've had some important gains over the last decade or two. The introduction of a new criminal justice system in 2008. Earlier than that, the development of a transparency law that gave us some of the great data that we looked at today. Right? So there is progress, and I think over the long term, as I always like to say in this annual forum, right, we have to be looking with sort of moderated expectations about what we can achieve in the short term, and have a long time horizon for understanding how big and monumental a problem we're dealing with, so that we can remain optimistic, right? Low expectations, long time horizon. And I think if we continue working together on these issues, we'll see continued progress. So always the optimist. I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, David, for those remarks. I want to thank you all for your patience and being with us. We will have the video from this conference up on the website. Many of the PowerPoints presentations will also be there, so you are welcome to avail yourself to those things. It's not surprising that an academic or a think tank conference ends with the conclusion that we need to do more study, but it's how we stay in business, right? And we appreciate that this is a space where we can look at all the complexities of these problems. It's not just a simple, easy answer, but there are a lot of complexities. So thank you all for your patience and your participation. A special word of thanks to Duncan again, and Angela Robertson for her work, Rachel Schmidtke and others on our Mexico Institute team. And I want to thank also the AV team for their excellent support here on audio visuals and for helping us with the web page and whatnot. So thank you again, and we'll have upcoming events that you should be hearing about soon enough. Thank you.